Natasha was always known for her competence and dedication as a private nurse. At 40 years old, she had worked with all kinds of patients, but she had never taken on a case as delicate as Alice Hughes. When she received the job offer to care for a young woman who had been in a coma for 5 years, Natasha saw it as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to help someone in need. The job was at an isolated mansion, and the patient was the daughter of the famous Dr. Noah Hughes, a renowned surgeon who had passed away shortly after his daughter fell into a vegetative state. The long drive to the mansion, located in the hills far from the city, gave Natasha time to think. What could have caused Alice to fall into a coma so suddenly? What would it be like to work in such a grand, yet tragic, home? Her hands gripped the steering wheel as the landscape changed from urban to rural. There was something about Alice's story that didn't feel right, something she couldn't ignore. When she finally arrived at the mansion, Natasha was greeted by Cecilia Hughes, Alice's stepmother. Cecilia was an elegant woman, impeccably dressed, with a nearly military posture. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face, though beautiful, seemed incapable of showing any genuine emotion. "Natasha, welcome," Cecilia said with a cold, calculated voice, not even offering a smile. "Alice is waiting for you. Or rather, she's in her usual state. Let me show you the way." Natasha followed Cecilia through the mansion's corridors, trying to absorb her surroundings. The walls were adorned with family portraits and expensive artwork, but there was something strange about the place. Despite all the luxury, the house felt devoid of life. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of Cecilia's shoes echoing on the marble floor. "This is the private wing where Alice stays," Cecilia said, stopping in front of a large dark wooden door. "She's been like this since shortly before my husband, Noah, passed away. It's been challenging, but we keep her comfortable. The treatment she's receiving is the best possible. Your only responsibility is to follow what's already prescribed. There's no need to try anything new. Her condition is stable, and that's how it should remain." Natasha noticed the commanding tone in Cecilia's voice, as if making it clear that disobedience would not be tolerated. This made Natasha wonder why Cecilia was so rigid about Alice's treatment. Why not try something new? Why the insistence on keeping everything unchanged? "Understood," Natasha replied, though her mind was full of questions. Cecilia opened the door, revealing Alice's room. The young woman lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment. Alice Hughes looked like a figure frozen in time. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her brown hair was delicately arranged on the pillow. Even in her vegetative state, there was something tragic and beautiful about her appearance, like an untouched porcelain doll. Natasha approached Alice, observing her delicate features. She didn't look older than 25, but her body showed signs of the time that had passed since she fell ill. Natasha felt a pang in her heart as she imagined the pain this young woman must have experienced before falling into a coma. Without knowing much about her story, Natasha already felt a connection to this sleeping life. Cecilia continued to watch closely. "As you can see, she's very well cared for. We do everything possible to ensure she's comfortable. There's no reason to change her medication. Her case is irreversible." The casual way Cecilia referred to the irreversibility of Alice's condition deeply disturbed Natasha. There was something in the stepmother's demeanor that seemed almost indifferent, as if Alice were just a burden to be carried. "I'll do my best to take care of her," Natasha said, trying to maintain professionalism, but feeling the urgency to learn more about the story behind this sleeping young woman. The following days followed an almost mechanical routine. Natasha administered medications, monitored vital signs, and adjusted Alice's position in bed to prevent bed sores. Despite the mansion's luxury, Alice's room was a sterile and cold space, without any personal touches. However, Natasha tried to warm the environment in any way she could. She spent hours by Alice's side, reading aloud or simply talking about trivial things, hoping that somehow Alice could hear her. Slowly, Natasha began to notice patterns. Cecilia visited Alice's room at specific times and always monitored the medications with obsessive precision. Nothing was changed without Cecilia's approval. Everything seemed timed, as if the stepmother was more interested in keeping Alice's condition unchanged than in promoting any possibility of recovery. One night, as the mansion sank into the eerie silence Natasha was beginning to recognize, she decided to flip through a photo album she found on a nearby shelf. Among the pictures were portraits of Alice and Noah during happier times. Natasha couldn't help but think about the connection between Noah's death and Alice's coma. Was it a coincidence? Or was there more behind this tragedy? These thoughts followed her as she walked through the mansion's empty corridors, with a growing feeling that something was very wrong there. Natasha knew that eventually, she would need to confront these doubts. But for now, she would follow Cecilia's orders, until she found the truth on her own. Days at the Hughes mansion followed the same unchanging routine. Natasha, always dedicated, performed her duties to the best of her ability, but something bothered her. The cold way Cecilia dealt with Alice's condition was disturbing. The nurse spent long periods in Alice's room, watching the young woman sleep, feeling the strange disconnection that enveloped the house. Despite being surrounded by luxury, there was a deep emptiness in every corner, as if the lives inside the mansion were frozen in time, especially Alice's. One night, Natasha was sitting in the chair beside Alice's bed, reading a book of poems aloud. It had become a habit, hoping that somehow, the words would reach Alice in her unconscious state. The room was bathed in a soft twilight, illuminated only by the lamp on the bedside table. The house was as silent as always, and Natasha could almost hear the steady hum of the machines monitoring Alice. Then, without warning, something happened. As she read the next verse of the poem, Natasha felt movement beside her. She turned quickly and saw something that left her speechless. Alice opened her eyes. At first, Natasha thought she was imagining things. Her eyes remained fixed on the young woman, waiting for it to be just an involuntary reflex, something natural for someone in a coma. But what she saw next made her question everything. Alice didn't just open her eyes, her expression was one of pure terror. Her gaze was wide, her eyes bulging as if she were seeing something frightening, as if she wanted to scream but couldn't. For a few endless seconds, Alice kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her eyes filled with panic and despair. Natasha felt fear creep down her spine. She wanted to call for help, but she was paralyzed, her heart pounding in her chest. Within seconds, Alice's eyes closed again, and she returned to her vegetative state, as if nothing had happened. The room returned to its oppressive silence, but Natasha knew that wasn't normal. She quickly stood up, still trembling, and went straight to Cecilia's office, determined to report what she had seen. Alice's gaze had been so real, so full of fear, that Natasha knew she couldn't simply ignore it. "Cecilia," Natasha said as soon as she reached the stepmother's office door. The dim light from the lamp reflected on Cecilia's face as she sat at her desk, a pile of papers in front of her. She looked up, appearing impatient with the interruption. "What's going on, Natasha? Isn't your shift over?" Natasha took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Something happened with Alice. She opened her eyes, and she looked terrified. "I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if she were trying to tell me something." For a moment, Cecilia seemed surprised, but she quickly regained her composure. A forced smile appeared on her face, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's impossible, Natasha. Alice has been in this state for 5 years. Maybe it was an involuntary reflex, like a muscle spasm. It happens with coma patients sometimes." "But it wasn't that," Natasha insisted. "I know what I saw." Her eyes were full of fear. It was like she was conscious for a moment. It couldn't have just been a reflex. Cecilia stood up from her chair, her expression becoming colder. "Natasha, you're a competent nurse, which is why I hired you. But it's important for you to understand that there's no hope of recovery for Alice. What you saw was just an involuntary reaction. Don't worry about it." Natasha wanted to believe she might have been imagining things, that perhaps the exhaustion of the job had caused an illusion. But Alice's gaze, that panic, wouldn't leave her mind. Something was very wrong. She knew it. Of course, Natasha replied, trying to hide her frustration. I just thought it was important to report what happened. Thank you for that, Cecilia said, returning her attention to the papers in front of her. But now, please return to your post. Alice is stable. And that's what matters. Natasha nodded, but she left the office with a growing sense of unease in her chest. Something in that house was wrong, and now, more than ever, Natasha knew she needed to find out what was going on. Alice wasn't just trapped in a coma, there was more to the story. Back in the room, Natasha sat again beside Alice, watching her with a mixture of sadness and curiosity. Why had she seemed so terrified? What was happening inside Alice's mind? The silence of the house suffocated her, and Cecilia's cold words echoed in her mind. She decided she wouldn't let it go. Alice had shown signs of consciousness, no matter how small, and Natasha would do whatever it took to find out what was happening. Even if it meant confronting Cecilia or crossing the limits imposed on her. After all, if Alice was somehow conscious inside her own body, who knew how long she had been trapped in this nightmare? After that disturbing night, Natasha could no longer look at Alice the same way. The terrified expression in the young woman's eyes wouldn't leave her mind. Something was very wrong, but she didn't have proof yet. Cecilia, with her cold and controlled behavior, clearly didn't believe her, or worse, didn't want to believe her. However, Natasha knew what she had seen, and her intuition told her there was more going on in that house. In the following days, Natasha began paying more attention to details she had previously overlooked. One specific point that bothered her was Cecilia's insistence on following the same routine, without any attempt to change Alice's treatment. The medications were carefully prescribed and distributed, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could be altered. It seemed more like a rigid rule than a medical recommendation. One afternoon, while organizing the medications, Natasha decided to take a closer look at the bottles. She knew she shouldn't, but something inside her pushed her to continue. The medication labels caught her attention. They came from a private pharmacy and contained substances that didn't seem typical for treating someone in a coma. One of the substance names sounded familiar, but Natasha couldn't remember where she had heard it before. Her experience as a nurse told her this wasn't something ordinary. Natasha then wrote down the name of the most suspicious substance and decided to investigate further. Deep down, she knew this could be a huge risk. Cecilia had already shown herself to be a controlling and obsessive woman about Alice's condition, and any misstep could cost Natasha her job and the possibility of continuing to help Alice. She stayed up all night, researching on her computer in the small guest room at the mansion. The information she found left her even more disturbed. The substance listed on the bottle was a coma-inducing drug. Natasha froze. It didn't make sense. Why would Alice, already in a coma, be receiving a substance that induces and maintains a state of unconsciousness? Her thoughts raced. Was someone deliberately keeping Alice in a coma? The next morning, Natasha knew she needed more answers. That's when she noticed something that could provide an important clue. Next to one of the medication bottles was the name of a doctor, Dr. Garrett. Natasha had never heard of him before, which was strange, considering Noah Hughes' medical background and his wide network of contacts. She decided she couldn't ignore this name. Discreetly, she contacted Dr. Garrett's office, pretending to be just a curious nurse about the treatment being given to her patient. The receptionist, polite, scheduled an appointment for Natasha the next day, and she decided she would personally speak with him. On the day of the appointment, Natasha arrived at Dr. Garrett's office. It was a small and modest medical office, far from the luxury that surrounded the Hughes life. When she was called in, she was greeted by a middle-aged man, with a tired but kind expression. Dr. Garrett seemed surprised to see a new nurse, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "You must be the new nurse for Alice," he said as he sat down at his desk. "I've heard about you. How can I help?" Natasha tried not to show her tension as she sat across from the doctor. "Yes, that's me. I've been caring for Alice Hughes. I've been following the prescriptions carefully, but I'd like to better understand the medications we're administering." Dr. Garrett nodded, opening Alice's medical history on his computer. He began talking about Alice's coma and the medications being used to maintain her stability. But then, something caught Natasha's attention. "There's something here that doesn't seem right," she said, hesitantly. "This particular substance, it's a coma inducer, right? Why are we administering something like that to someone who's already in a coma?" Dr. Garrett paused for a moment, clearly taken aback by the question. He looked at the records on the screen, furrowing his brow. "It's interesting that you mention that. I've been prescribing these medications for some time, but, wait." He paused, clicking on some older documents in the system. "Look at this. The first prescription was signed before Alice fell into a coma." Natasha was stunned. The revelation was shocking. How could Alice have been receiving a coma-inducing drug before she even fell into a vegetative state? Dr. Garrett seemed perplexed by what he had just discovered. "Could this be a date error?" Natasha suggested, even though she knew something more was behind it. "It could be," Dr. Garrett said, clearly disturbed. "But I have to be honest with you. This doesn't seem right. I don't remember prescribing that substance at that time, but the signatures are here. If something is wrong, we need to investigate further. I'll provide you with a copy of this record, in case you need it." Natasha accepted the copy with trembling hands. She now had clear evidence that something was terribly wrong. She didn't know if Dr. Garrett was involved or if he was also a victim of manipulation, but that didn't matter right now. The most important thing was that Alice, as it appeared, had been deliberately placed into a coma. "And if we stop this medication?" Natasha asked, hesitantly. "Do you think she could wake up?" Dr. Garrett was thoughtful for a few seconds before responding. "There's that possibility. But it would be a risky move. If something is being done intentionally, stopping the medication could bring complications. However, if you have enough evidence to prove there's been a mistake." Natasha knew this was her first major lead. She thanked the doctor and left the office with her mind buzzing with thoughts. Why would Alice have been deliberately placed in a coma? What was Cecilia trying to hide? Back at the mansion, Natasha knew she had a mission now. She would need to act very carefully because if Cecilia suspected anything, she could stop any progress. But one thing was certain, Natasha wouldn't stand by idly. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the risk. After her conversation with Dr. Garrett, Natasha knew she was dealing with something much bigger than a simple case of negligence. Alice had been deliberately placed in a coma, and all signs pointed to Cecilia being behind it. But to act safely, Natasha needed more concrete evidence, something that would confirm the fraud and Cecilia's guilt. In the days that followed, Natasha continued working cautiously, following the routine of caring for Alice, but her thoughts were always focused on discovering the truth. She knew the key was in the documents left by Noah or somewhere hidden within the mansion itself. During one of her night rounds, Natasha had an idea: Alice's medical reports. As a nurse with years of experience, Natasha knew that medical reports are the foundation of any diagnosis, and if something were wrong with Alice's case, it would certainly be reflected there. With that thought in mind, she decided the best way to find out what was wrong would be to investigate the young woman's medical files. One quiet night, while everyone was asleep, Natasha decided to go to Noah's office. It was a room that almost no one had used since the doctor's death. The room was practically frozen in time, with stacks of organized papers and shelves full of medical books. The air inside felt heavy, laden with memories and secrets. Natasha began carefully going through the drawers and files. She found personal and financial documents, but what really interested her was Alice's medical history. Finally, after almost an hour of searching, she found a thick folder labeled with Alice's name. Upon opening the folder, Natasha found detailed medical reports attesting to Alice's vegetative state. They described that Alice had suffered a severe brain injury, which would justify her deep coma and the need for the medications being administered, including the coma-inducing drug Natasha had already identified. However, something didn't seem right. Natasha examined the documents more closely. The brain injury described in the reports was severe, but Noah had never mentioned such a thing in his previous medical correspondence, according to other documents Natasha had seen. Furthermore, when she looked at the signature on the medical report, Natasha noticed something strange. Dr. Garrett's name was there, but the signature was different from the one she had seen on the medical records he had recently given her. Natasha's heart began to race. She compared the signature on the report with the copy of the records Dr. Garrett had provided. The signatures were clearly different. Natasha was dealing with a forged document. The nurse felt a mixture of anger and shock. The reports attesting to Alice's condition had been falsified to justify the administration of the medications that were keeping Alice in a coma. Cecilia had somehow managed to fabricate medical evidence to cover up what was really happening with Alice. This explained why no one had questioned the treatment until now. Everything appeared official in the medical records. Natasha looked back at Alice, who was still asleep in her bed, trapped in a state that Natasha was now sure had been artificially induced. It was painful to imagine the suffering Alice might be enduring, trapped inside herself, unable to wake up because of Cecilia's actions. But why would Cecilia do this? The answer was clear: inheritance. By taking control of Alice's life, Cecilia had become the sole person responsible for the vast Hughes fortune. Keeping Alice in a coma was the safest way to ensure that she remained in control, without risking losing her luxurious lifestyle. With this new discovery, Natasha knew she had a crucial piece of evidence. If she could confront Dr. Garrett with the forged report, he would confirm that he had never signed such a document, which would completely expose Cecilia. But she needed to be careful. Cecilia was a calculating woman, and any reckless move could cost Natasha her own life, or worse, condemn Alice to continue being trapped in that coma. Natasha took a deep breath. She had to think clearly. Now, more than ever, she needed a plan. The nurse knew the best way to move forward was to stop administering the coma-inducing drug to Alice without Cecilia noticing. If Alice could wake up, she would have the chance to expose the truth. But time was running out, and Natasha knew Cecilia wasn't naive. Soon, the stepmother would realize something was wrong, and the situation would become even more dangerous. Natasha knew she was playing a dangerous game. Cecilia was a shrewd woman, and any slip could cost her the job or, worse, put her own life and Alice's at risk. However, with the evidence in hand, the forged medical report and the knowledge that Alice's condition had been induced, Natasha knew she couldn't wait any longer. It was time to act. The first thing Natasha decided to do was stop administering the drug that was keeping Alice in a coma. Instead of giving the young woman the prescribed substance, Natasha replaced the liquid with a harmless solution. The plan was simple: allow Alice's body to recover and wait for her to wake up naturally. The biggest challenge, however, was pretending that everything was normal. Natasha needed to do this without raising any suspicion. Each day, Natasha followed the routine as if nothing had changed. She administered the fake injections, adjusted the monitoring equipment, and always kept a close eye on Alice, waiting for the moment she would show signs of improvement. Her heart raced with each passing day without Cecilia noticing what was happening. Then, on a quiet night, when the house was enveloped in its usual silence, it happened. Natasha was adjusting Alice's pillows when she suddenly noticed a slight movement. Her heart almost stopped. Alice was waking up. Alice's eyes opened slowly. At first, she seemed confused, her eyes blinking repeatedly as she tried to adjust to the soft light in the room. Natasha held her breath, waiting to see if it was real. And then, Alice whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. Where am I?" Alice said, her voice barely audible. "Where's my dad?" Natasha felt a lump in her throat. How would she tell Alice the truth? The young woman had been trapped in a coma for 5 years, and during that time, her father had passed away. How could she tell her that she had missed the chance to say goodbye to him? Natasha knew she had to be honest, but she also knew the truth would be a devastating blow to Alice. She sat down beside the bed, holding Alice's fragile hand. "Alice, you've been asleep for a long time. Your father, he passed away a few years ago." Alice's eyes widened, and tears began to well up. "No, it can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. I never got to say goodbye to him." Natasha gently squeezed her hand, trying to offer comfort. "I know. I'm so sorry. But your stepmother, Cecilia, she lied to you. She kept you like this, in a coma, all this time. I only recently discovered what was happening. And I promise I'll help you. We'll end this together." Alice blinked several times, trying to absorb what she had just heard. Shock and sadness were written all over her face, but then something changed in her eyes. Determination. She looked directly at Natasha, wiping away the tears. "What do I need to do?" Alice asked, her voice still weak, but filled with new strength. Natasha leaned in closer to the young woman. "You need to pretend that you're still in a coma. If Cecilia finds out you're awake, she might try to hurt you again. I'm going to leave the room now, call the police, and hand over all the evidence we have. Tomorrow, this will all be over." Alice nodded slowly, though fear was still visible in her eyes. The idea of lying there, conscious and pretending to be asleep, was terrifying. However, she trusted Natasha. For the first time in years, Alice felt that someone was on her side, fighting for her. The two of them looked at each other for a moment longer, a silence full of unspoken emotions. "I know this is hard, Alice, but you're strong. You've been through so much. Just a little longer, and it will all be over." Alice nodded again. "I trust you." Natasha then stood up, adjusting the blankets around Alice as if nothing had happened. She gave the young woman one last look before walking toward the door. Her steps were light, but her heart was heavy with tension. The plan was in motion. All that remained was to leave without drawing attention. But as she opened the door, Natasha froze. Cecilia was standing in the hallway, with a curious expression on her face. "I heard you talking," Cecilia said, her voice soft but tinged with suspicion. "Were you talking to Alice?" "I didn't know nurses had a habit of speaking to coma patients." Natasha's heart raced, but she kept her composure. Yes. I always do. I believe that talking to them helps humanize the treatment, you know? Even if they don't respond, I believe that, somehow, it reaches them." For a moment that seemed like an eternity, Cecilia was silent, watching Natasha with assessing eyes. Would she believe her? Natasha knew that one mistake could cost everything. Finally, Cecilia gave a short, emotionless smile. "Interesting. I never thought of that." She stepped aside, leaving the way clear for Natasha to pass. "Keep up the good work, Natasha." Natasha breathed a sigh of relief internally, but she maintained a calm expression. "Thank you. I'll continue doing my best." And with that, she left the hallway, her hands still trembling slightly. In the room, Alice had heard everything. Her body remained still, but her heart raced. She knew she had to keep pretending. She had to stay calm. The moment of truth was approaching, and finally, she would have the chance to escape her nightmare. The next morning, Natasha woke up earlier than usual, her heart heavy with the responsibility of ending this nightmare. The plan was in motion, and Alice was now conscious, waiting for the right moment to act. Natasha knew that every step would be crucial. She needed to call the police discreetly and ensure that Cecilia was confronted with the evidence. Everything had to be done without Cecilia realizing what was about to happen. As she prepared for the day, Natasha maintained her usual routine. At breakfast, Cecilia was, as always, absorbed in her own thoughts, controlling everything around her with her cold gaze. Natasha tried not to show any nervousness. She knew the stepmother was intelligent and that any sign of agitation could ruin everything. As soon as she finished breakfast, Natasha went to Alice's room, checked the equipment and the young woman's position, keeping up the facade that everything was normal. Alice's eyes were closed, pretending to still be in a coma, as they had planned. Natasha approached and whispered softly, "Today it will all end. Stay calm." Alice remained motionless, but Natasha knew the young woman was listening. The weight of the moment was palpable. Natasha gave one last look at Alice before leaving the room, determined to execute the next phase of the plan. The nurse went to a public phone a few blocks from the mansion to ensure that Cecilia wouldn't suspect anything. There, she called the police and reported her discovery without giving too many details. "I have proof of medical fraud and believe someone is being kept in a coma against their will. I need officers sent to the Hughes mansion immediately." On the other end of the line, the dispatcher was initially confused, but given the seriousness of Natasha's tone, he assured her that a squad car would be sent. The confrontation was set. Back at the mansion, Natasha entered through the back door, her heart racing. She knew that now everything depended on how well she could keep calm until the police arrived. However, there was a nagging feeling that Cecilia was more vigilant than ever. And her intuition was right. As she climbed the stairs, Natasha ran into Cecilia in the hallway. The stepmother, with a suspicious expression, abruptly stopped her. "You seem more nervous today, Natasha," Cecilia said, her tone laden with suspicion. "Is there something I should know?" Natasha forced a smile. "No, just a normal day. Alice is stable, as always. I'm just a little tired. Nothing to worry about." Cecilia kept her gaze fixed for a long moment. It was as if she were evaluating each word Natasha said, trying to find a flaw in the story. The tension was suffocating, but Natasha couldn't let herself falter. If Cecilia suspected that something was happening, the entire plan would fall apart. "I hope you're right," Cecilia said, with a cold and artificial smile. "Remember, Natasha, I'm always aware of everything that happens here." Natasha nodded, trying to appear calm. "Of course. I know that." She slowly walked away, feeling Cecilia's eyes boring into her back as she returned to Alice's room. As soon as she entered the room, she locked the door behind her. Time was running out. Now all that remained was to wait for the police to arrive before Cecilia realized what was going on. A few minutes later, Natasha heard voices and the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the mansion. The police had arrived. Natasha left Alice's room and descended the stairs, trying to maintain her composure. When she reached the foyer, she saw that two officers were speaking with Cecilia. The stepmother, with her usual expression of control, looked at Natasha with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Natasha, what's going on here?" Cecilia asked, her voice sweet but calculated. "Why are the police at my house?" Natasha took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. "I called them, Cecilia. I know what you did to Alice. I have the evidence." Cecilia's face paled. For a brief second, the mask of coldness she always wore broke, revealing a flicker of panic in her eyes. However, the stepmother quickly regained her composure and laughed, as if Natasha were telling a joke. "Evidence? What kind of evidence could you have, Natasha? You've only been here a short time and have no idea what you're talking about." "I have the medical reports that prove Alice's condition," Natasha said, keeping her voice firm. "And I also have the documents that prove you forged those reports, faking Dr. Garrett's signature. You kept Alice in a coma all this time to control her fortune. And now, she's awake and ready to tell the truth." The impact of Natasha's words hit like a bomb in the mansion's foyer. Cecilia, realizing she was cornered, stepped back, her expression of control completely unraveling. Fear and anger mixed in her eyes. "This is ridiculous!" Cecilia exclaimed, her voice finally betraying her desperation. "You have no idea what you're saying. I've always cared for Alice in the best way possible. If she's in a coma, it's because of her medical condition, and I did everything I could to keep her alive." But before Cecilia could continue, the door to Alice's room opened, and the young woman, still visibly weak, appeared, leaning against the door frame. The officers turned, shocked to see Alice standing. You kept me prisoner," Alice said, her voice still low but filled with emotion. "I lost my father because of you. You left me in a coma to steal the life that was mine." The shock on Cecilia's face was undeniable. She looked at Alice as if she were seeing a ghost. For a few moments, she was paralyzed, not knowing what to do or say. Finally, she tried to retreat, but the two officers moved forward, ready to arrest her. Natasha approached Alice, holding her arm to offer support. "It's all over now, Alice. It's over." Cecilia, still in shock, began to shout. "No! This is a lie. You're trying to incriminate me. I always did my best for Alice. Always. She would be dead without me." The officers didn't waste any more time. One of them stepped forward while the other read her rights. Cecilia tried to resist, but she was soon handcuffed and taken out through the front door, still shouting words of denial. Natasha felt relief wash over her. Finally, the nightmare was over. She turned to Alice, whose eyes were filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, not pain. "I told you we would make it," Natasha whispered, with a gentle smile. Alice nodded, taking a deep breath. She knew that, finally, her life was hers again. The sky was gray that day, with a soft breeze carrying fallen leaves through the cemetery. Natasha walked beside Alice, who was still slowly recovering from all the years she had spent in a coma. Although she was physically weaker, Alice now carried a new inner strength, something that sustained her even in the most difficult moments. They stopped in front of a simple but imposing gravestone. Engraved in clear letters was the name of Dr. Noah Hughes, the father Alice loved deeply but had been separated from for so long. Natasha watched as Alice approached, her breath hesitant. Finally, she was here to say goodbye. "Hi, Dad," Alice said softly, holding a small bouquet of flowers in her trembling hands. "I wish I could have been with you before. I wish you knew how much I love you." Natasha stepped back, letting Alice live that moment alone. There was something deeply moving about seeing the young woman, who had been a prisoner of a nightmare for so many years, finally having the chance to speak with her father, even if belatedly. Alice knelt in front of the gravestone, placing the flowers on the ground with care. Tears silently streamed down her face as she whispered words of farewell, words she had never had the chance to say while her father was still alive. Natasha felt a tightness in her chest as she watched the sadness and pain, but also Alice's strength. It was a painful farewell, but a necessary one. "I forgive you, Dad," Alice continued, wiping her eyes. "I know you didn't know what was happening. I'm going to be okay now, I promise. And I'm going to honor you, in the best way I can." After a long silence, Alice stood up and turned to Natasha, who smiled softly. The two women had gone through a journey that no one else would understand. Natasha stepped forward and, in a simple gesture, took Alice's hand, offering her all the support she knew the young woman would still need. "Thank you for everything, Natasha," Alice said, her voice still weak but full of gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come along. You saved me." Natasha squeezed Alice's hand firmly. "You saved yourself, Alice. I was just here to help." They stood there for a moment longer, in silence, enjoying the fresh air and the feeling of relief that finally permeated their lives. The nightmare was over. Cecilia was in prison, and Alice had her life back, though there was much to rebuild. Natasha knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey for Alice, and she would be by the young woman's side as she rediscovered and rebuilt herself. Natasha also reflected on how her own life had changed. Alice's case had touched her heart in ways she had never imagined. She had learned that sometimes, kindness and the courage to act in the face of injustice could completely change someone's life. And, in a way, saving Alice had also transformed her. Natasha felt different, more connected to life, with a renewed sense of purpose. A few months later, the Hughes mansion, which had once seemed like a cold and lifeless place, was now a completely different environment. Alice had decided to keep the house, turning it into a true home. Natasha visited regularly, offering emotional support and helping Alice adapt to her new world. The laughter of the two echoed through the hallways, filling the once empty spaces with renewed joy. In the main room, Alice had hung a portrait of her father. It was her way of keeping him close, even though he was now only present in spirit. And next to Noah's photo, she placed a new one, a picture of her and Natasha, taken in the mansion's garden, both smiling. Now, without Cecilia's shadow looming over their lives, Alice could finally look toward the future. And Natasha knew that, as fate had brought them together in such an unexpected way, they would always have each other. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.